Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? If you want to drop a quick thumbs up or yes in chat, that'd be amazing. There we go. I'm starting to see some thumbs. Awesome, awesome. So first of all, thank you for hanging out with us so far. It's 3 p.m., so you've been some strong foot soldiers hanging out, so we appreciate it. This is the last but not least, I believe, right before our closeout with Q&A. So, and Amy, keep me honest, but I believe that's the case. So thank you. So this segment is specifically about accelerating development with using GitHub Copilot. We'll talk a little bit about, well, as you might imagine, GitHub Copilot. We'll play around with it a little bit more. We'll spend a significant amount of time on preview and experimental features, and specifically how you would get into those, right? I've found that a lot of people don't know certain things about, Visual Studio Code insiders and how do you get these experimental features. And I want to make sure that, you as developers have access to that and you can start leveraging that in your daily workflow. And then we talk a little bit about some use cases. So before we get to that, though, my name is Matt Kravitz. I'm a senior software engineer here at Concurrency. Um, in my previous life, I used to work a little bit in law enforcement. I'm a big Formula One fan. Recently married, recently, almost a year, so freshly baked husband. And I've been a lifelong technologist. I've been around computers since the very beginning. I've been video gaming, never been a console guy, more of a PC guy. I built my very first PC. I think I was like 10. So I was always involved with technology. And then I made a career of it. So very happy to be here. Very thankful for the opportunity to speak to you guys. As I had mentioned a little bit, LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me, there's my LinkedIn. Don't forget. I have an attendee list. I'll probably go through it and connect with you guys anyway. So I'll hunt you down. So I'll give you an opportunity to just to scan that real quick. Otherwise, you'll be looking out for an invite from me. But with that said, let's kick it off to our agenda. So again, Copilot 101, we'll talk a little about what it is, why it matters. I really want to talk about what it isn't and what it isn't going to do. I found that developers are often a little bit more skeptical of it as a technology and what it can or can't do. And I'm here to talk to you about that to see if we can, help turn the page on that. We'll have some hands-on workshops. We'll talk a little bit about some of the, again, preview and experimental features. We'll try and incorporate those into our workshop. And then really we'll talk about measuring impact with GitHub Copilot and how organizations and development team leaders can start to explore, hey, is this worth it for me? Is this not worth it for me? What's the ROI? So we'll spend some time on that and then talk a little bit about how we adopt it. It's not as simple as, well, it was as simple as turning it on in the organization and saying, hey, here you go, guys, start using it. And it is just that simple, but using Copilot effectively is as much a skill as Googling is. I found, Googling is a skill that you learn and you're a more effective Googler the more you do it. That is the same exact case with GitHub Copilot and how you use it. And we'll get a little bit about, we'll talk about that a little bit. I wanted to start with some numbers. So if you were in any of the previous sessions, I know that Brian Hayden mentioned some of these numbers, but I really wanted to drill that home from an adoption perspective and how it impacts developers. But over 50,000 organizations have adopted Copilot, and this is old because that's from, I think, the Q3 of 24. I wouldn't be surprised if this number hasn't doubled since then. But 55% faster code delivery. 85% of developers feel more confident, but most importantly, I think of these is the bottom one, which is 95% of developers are reporting that they enjoyed coding more. Why do you think that is? I personally think that that's because, frankly, you get to do and spend time on the thing that matters most. Gone are the days where you need to, spend an exuberant amount of time on building a repository, data access layer or anything like that. You can use Copilot to do that and accelerate that development. Get developers to do what you want them to do, not the meaningless stuff that you not necessarily want them to focus on. Um, I will say really quickly, I wanted to mention if there's any questions, do throw them in the chat. I'll try and monitor that as we go. There's a Q&A section as well, so just keep going. And then Amy, if there's anything, if you could please yell at me and let me know that I'm missing something, that'd be awesome. The one other statistic that I wanted to make mention of that's not necessarily denoted here is that 43% of the survey takers found GitHub Copilot extremely easy to use, and 51% found it extremely useful. And I think that the 49% just haven't used it the way that the other 51% have. And most specifically, I wanted to get a little bit about, first of all, what is it, right? So meeting GitHub Copilot, what is GitHub Copilot, and what it isn't. And I will say that what you're seeing on the screen here with the code completions and such, I get it. That's how it started. I don't necessarily agree that that's where we are. That's not what Copilot or GitHub Copilot is. Does it do it? Yes. Does it do it fairly well? Sure. But really the value add is some of the other things that we'll be talking about today, which are the edit mode or specific the agent mode, which is currently in preview. And we'll get to that in a little bit. One of the things that, and last time we did this, we had an on-site, so it was much easier to talk about this. But I was really curious if the team has any or if the audience has any concerns about GitHub Copilot, and if you have any concerns about jobs or the industry or what it's doing, like I think please throw those in the chat and we could talk about those a little bit more. The one I will talk to you about, what I perceived to be a concern before, and that's, what is it going to do with my job, right? It's my living, it's how we make money, and I will say that very quickly I decided that rather than being afraid of it and thinking about what it's going to do to my role as a developer, or my coworkers who I like working with, I started to rather than be skeptical of it, I decided to lean into it, and I found that that's the best way to make sure that it doesn't do what I'm afraid of. If you're skeptical of it, it will definitely at some point you're going to fall behind, right? We're in the technology industry. Things are always changing. You are lifelong learners. So definitely lean into it. Definitely do your research. Definitely try and find more stuff about this. Find more use cases. My personal use cases and the most valuable use cases were unit tests, as well as documentation. That was the number one. The number two are the top two perfect use cases that I've seen it work across teams. I've seen it work for me, and it really helped me alleviate some of those concerns is once I started using it for those unit tests, for that documentation. Why? Because it made me more efficient. It made me more efficient, and it allowed my, either my our clients or our internal team members to see, hey, now we can start to leverage, Mac and for what he may be better at, rather than doing some documentation and such and such and such. But it also increases the efficiency, right? Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? We're trying to accelerate our development team. And if the developers don't need to spend 2 hours documenting a feature, they can throw a prompt up and get the result all in 30 seconds. That's 2 hours that they can otherwise spend designing, architecting, or POCing the next best thing. And that's definitely a point to talk about. Now, we're going to move on to really how do we get started, right? And what my recommendations are for the acceleration of your teams. I don't know by a show of hands who's familiar with Visual Studio Code Insiders. If you're not, it is a nightly pre-release build of VSC, of VS Code. It's actually an independent IDE or independent code editor that you can download. If you Google Visual Studio Code Insiders now, you can download it. It's got a different icon. We'll get to it a little bit. It gets nightly updates. It's a little bit less stable, if you will, but I've been using it. I've not noticed any difference. But the most important single thing, in my opinion, is that you get access to more experimental and more preview features that you wouldn't otherwise get with your regular release of Visual Studio Code. And that's important because some of the things that we'll be talking about today are not in your regular Visual Studio code release. And so I wanted to just mention two things that are actively in preview and experimental, and then we'll talk through and play with them a little bit. And you know, when I did this last, I found that we spent a lot of time talking about what is in preview and what is experimental and how do you get to it in the first place. I think that that's half the battle in getting up to speed and starting to actually leverage these tools. So if without further ado, let's just get into it. One of the preview features that are out in Visual Studio Code Insiders today are these things called custom instructions. And I'll show you exactly how it looks in Visual Studio Code Insiders here in a second, but it effectively allows you to describe in a standardized fashion some guidelines or rules for your completions or for your edits, and that's really important, especially when you can start to check that in for consistency across your development team, and it allows the onboarding of new developers to they start to be useful much more quicker. Not to say that they weren't before, but a new developer takes some time to upskill in that code base, figure out where things are. And then they submit a PR, and then all of a sudden there's something that they missed or something that they didn't do the way that we do. Well, using Git custom instructions for your prompts, you can actually start to ensure that that's the case, that the developer gets to a state that they can start to be meaningful and impactful very quickly. Now, I'll show you exactly how that works. What I have here is an example of what that may look like. But let's say that we're working on a React application. Well, an example of those guidelines may very well be, or these coding standards may very well be, this very tidbit, right? Is we're using TypeScript, we prefer immutable data, yada yada yada. We're using functional components rather than class components, and things like that. Naming conventions. This is very much akin to I mean, your editor has standards that you could throw into it, whether you're using Visual Studio Code or I'm sorry, Visual Studio or Rider, whatever it may be. You can throw these in, but you also need to then specify it for your specific IDE and then maintain that and yada yada yada. This is a very quick, surefire way to make sure that you can apply those standards and again, keep it consistent. So I'm going to stop sharing my deck real fast and show you exactly what I'm talking about, and we're going to walk the walk. 1 second here. Bear with me. All right, cool. All right, can everybody see two side-by-side Visual Studio Code IDEs? I believe you should be able to see that. And that's Visual Studio. One is Visual Studio Code. One is Visual Studio Code Insiders. Very much so the same. Ignore the extensions. Those are my own extensions that I just happen to have in one but not the other. And if you one of the number one things specific to GitHub Copilot is that when you open the chat, so on the left, by the way, we have Visual Studio Code Insiders, sorry, and then on the right, we have just regular Visual Studio Code. How do we enable preview features? First of all, if you just hit Control, comma, and just go into your settings, and it's enough to just go ahead and search for Copilot, and we'll do this side by side so you could see the difference. On the left, which is Insiders, you have not much more, but significantly more preview and experimental features than experimental features on the regular release. And that's important because, again, you get to play with some of the newer stuff, but play is the wrong word because you could use this stuff in today right away and make use of it. And we'll show you how and actually build something with it. So in terms of instructions specifically, you could enable that by going in and going into settings.json. You could specify your instructions, or we're actually doing it using just a file, just a markdown file in a GitHub directory, and you could potentially check that in if you'd like, and keep that within your code repository to keep things pretty consistent. I've already enabled it. I have some things that I don't have enabled, but I have enabled instructions. So that's how it looks from the Visual Studio Code Insider side. On the Visual Studio Code regular side, you also have the instructions, but you don't necessarily have other things. And the most important one is agent mode. So in agent mode, as you can see on the left here in my chat, I have the selection to choose. Well, actually, let's go back to just regular ask. I have the selection to choose different models. First of all, when you have that many models to choose, what do you choose? I leave that up to you to decide. There's a few articles that I'm happy to share that kind of describe what models do what best. 4.0 is the more like kind of jack of all trades kind of a model. There are some models that are better at refactoring, some are just faster, some are better at full rewrites in a different language. It's really whatever use case you may need. If you're just looking for a general one, like I said, 4.0 is pretty good. If you have some that are missing here, that means that your organization's GitHub administrator hasn't yet enabled certain deployments and hasn't yet made them available to you. So just be cognizant of that. Now, what I really wanted to focus on for just 1 second is this Copilot agent mode, right? So we have our regular Copilot that we can ask questions of, and that's similar to just Visual Studio Code, where you can, simply make requests, and it's really, is it good? It's okay as long as you feed it the right information, as long as you feed it the right prompt. Again, it's a skill, but it doesn't really have context of your workspace. In an agent mode, we do. And so what you can then do is ask it a question about something, and you can add context to it, and it could be your code base, so everything that's in the open folder that you have, or it could be a specific file. So I could do something like hashtag newform.tsx and include that and say, hey, include that in my prompt and specifically reference that file and ask a question about it or ask it to do something. Or I could go into edit mode and say, hey, help me with something. And it might be something as simple as, refactoring a method or a function to have a, I don't know, lower cyclomatic complexity, whatever it may be. It will actually make the edits for you in your file, and we'll show you that, and help you with that. And then there's agent mode, and the agent mode is going to be something that we're going to be using later today, and specifically using it to build us a full-fledged application, and it's going to do it like that. So what I'm going to move on to right now is specifically the Copilot instructions, right? So with my instructions, I'm going to actually full screen this so that we can see this. I went ahead and I started a Copilot instructions MD file. I'm actually happy to share some of the knowledge articles about how to set this up, but within your directory, it's enough to just sort of .github, not a .git, .github folder, and throw in a Copilot instructions markdown file, and you can do something as simple as please add a hello world to every file that you create, right? And that could be sure, that could be your instructions, but again, simple example, and we'll get to something more difficult. Now, I'm in agent mode, and so what it automatically did is because I have this current markdown file turned on or visible, it detects it. That's the current prompt, and so. But I could also close it and it'll have context of it, or I can specifically add it as well. Add Copilot instructions to my request, and say, hey, please create a new TypeScript class, whatever. And I would expect it in agent mode to go ahead and do exactly what it did, which it went ahead and created a new class TypeScript file, had a constructor and a greet and hello from new class, right? It had that hello world. Now, I could have gotten more specific, and we will here in a second, but that was just an example of how that would work. And in agent mode, how it would just go ahead and create things for you. So if we go ahead and say keep, we're done working on this. We're going to move on to a more specific instruction, and that's what we saw before, which is going to use TypeScript for all new code and some other things that we may want to include in here. And so I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm still in agent mode, and I'm going to say, please create a new. And by the way, these prompts are extremely rudimentary, and we'll show you a little bit more about how to best prompt your agents so that they're more useful. But please create a new class, or sorry, a new component. I want it to be a new a component to display a grid of random information, right? Now, I never specified React. I never specified TypeScript. I never specified much of anything. But it went ahead and created actually, it did more. It created a grid display.tsx file since we're using TypeScript. It's a React component using it's a React functional component. It's using a use effect hook. All of that, right? At the touch of actually a sentence or two sentences. Now, again, very rudimentary example, nothing world changing, but if you really think about the use cases, and again, specifically my use cases are unit testing and documentation, and we'll get to a little bit about that here in a second. Very powerful because it could actually write your unit tests. Or if you want to do test-driven development, one of the things that I've tried doing before is taking just requirements from a user story or from a PBI and pasting it in there and saying, hey, I would like to build functionality to my workspace and does this. You would be surprised and very I was for sure perturbed, if that's the right word, when I found that how well it built my unit tests, especially since it has context of the code space there specifically, and so it can build those unit tests in accordance with how other unit tests are already built. So let's move on from that and move on to another experimental feature that I really liked that I wanted to give you guys a quick shout here for. Is there a token limit on the prompt? Really quickly, Adrian. Yes. So one of the things that I've tried doing before Here, hold on one second. One of the things that I've tried doing is actually going and using Copilot to build some data in a database, and it was meant to build a pretty big SQL script, insert script for me. It did flunk out on that. I asked it to do too much, and so I asked it to build about or insert about 20,000 records. There was a token limit on that. It didn't allow me to go that far, but it at least helped me, get it all set up and squared away so that I can move on further. So there was certainly that limitation that we needed to be mindful of. Here, let me share my screen once more, and then we'll kick off with the next thing. But the next thing I wanted to show here, let me see if we are. The next thing I wanted to show, this is an experimental feature, is prompts. So, well, not prompts aren't experimental in and of themselves, but specifically in Visual Studio Code Insider's experimental features, right now, what you can do is store your prompts in your code repositories. In the same similar fashion that we just talked about Copilot instructions and how you can store those in your GitHub repo, you can do the same with the prompts specific in your GitHub repo. And it's a followed, the file standard is whatever prompt name you have for your file, .prompt, .markdown, and Copilot will automatically detect that and understand that, this is the prompt I want to use. And why is that important? That is important because you can start to systemically allow your development teams or incorporate this into your development team, include very well fleshed out prompts. This is not an example of that, by the way, that fully builds out fully allows other development team members to take a prompt and start using it. Why is this useful? Well, the biggest ROI for me in terms of that is using it for code reviews and making sure that standards are met. And so if I was to check in an API review prompt in Markdown, what I can use that for is, again, much more well thought out. I would put a lot more effort into this. That's what I would recommend. But what you can do is insert this prompt, and once you have some code developed, you can actually ask it to verify that, hey, my API endpoint meets this criteria. The other example that's useful is boilerplate. And so if you're starting off a new project, you can fully leverage this prompt file to ask it to do something in a standardized fashion, such as versions or certain packages, whatever it may be. Now, I've prepared a short form create prompt, and what I'm going to do is just open that prompt up, and in agent mode in 4.0 is ask it, please create this. Just as much as that, because it's going to use that prompt. Now, one of the things that we've asked it to do is ask for the form name and field if not provided. So that's exactly what it did in agent mode, is that, create a new React component following your provided guidelines. I need the following details. Form name, I want it to be test form, right? That's fine. Fields, let's do first name, last name, and middle initial. And validation rules, I want the middle initial to be only a single character caps value. Now, Copilot, understanding that this is my, again, rudimentary prompt, and the information I provided for it, is going to go ahead and do that. Now, you are seeing it think. Oh, 1 second. We're having some some technical difficulties here. So let me delete that. We are seeing it, first of all, wig out. Part of it might be a different issue. All right, so perfect. Woo! Especially when you're doing a hands-on demo, sometimes you have to, you have to have your heart and throat moment. Now, I gave it some of the prompts. It used the prompt file I provided for it. It went ahead and asked me some questions to understand what form to build, and then it went ahead and did it, right. And it also did it to the accordance that according to the prompt that I specified for it. It used Yup. It used a functional component, and it went ahead and just used raw HTML to build the components. But if in your use case you're using MUI or whatever, or if you're building something in Blazor, you could just as well leverage that, and it will go ahead and do it for you. Again, big ROI example here is boilerplate unit testing and documentation. But now let's talk a little bit about less about agent mode and what the differences are and some of the experimental features. I want to get into talking with you a little bit about some of the actual use cases, some of the real world examples of where Copilot can have tremendous value to your developers, or you if you're a developer. So let me get my screen up here in just 1 second. Cool. So this is an example, right? This is what we just talked about. We just went through this. I had a slide to cover what we quickly talked about, which is these reusable prompt files. Again, that is an experimental feature available to users only in Visual Studio Code Insiders. I didn't mention Visual Studio Code Insiders is free, by the way, so it's not like there's so as long as you have GitHub Copilot, you're good, and you have access to these experimental features. But now let's talk a little bit about how teams actually use it. And some of the examples. So one of the things I didn't mention to you is that there are just like regular old slash commands or and others, kind of like a MMORPG. But you could at your terminal and you can ask it to do certain things. You can actually ask it questions about Git. So if you forget how to undo the last commit and git reset head, if you forget how to do that, you can ask it to do just that. It'll go ahead and actually take care of it for you. So it's these little, again, from my perspective, is it going to change my every is it going to tremendously change how I code? Yes, it is. Is it going to make my life easy? Yes, it is. That's ultimately what we want, right? Is the little annoying things that force you to alt tab, go to Google, figure it out. How do you do this? How do you Now it's at your fingertips within your IDE. You no longer have to worry about it. And does it really matter within the context of a single day? No, but when you start adding it up to weeks and months, that's where it truly matters, because it lets you do exactly what you need to do, which is develop more and worry about what we want to do. You've probably seen this before if you're using Copilot today, which is just fix. If you're having an error specifically, you're able to highlight that. You can use Copilot to fix the error. My personal take on this, I really haven't used this nearly as much. I typically use just the prompting within Copilot Studio, and I say, something along the lines of, help me troubleshoot this bug or whatever. And I like doing it more that way. But for the simple IntelliSense use cases, it can help you there too. But so can IntelliSense. So that's not really anything hugely monumental. One of the ones that we're going to get to here is actually documentation. So you can highlight a bit of code, and this was game changer for me, by the way. You can highlight a function or a bit of code and actually call /doc. And when you call /doc, it'll document the functionality of the function or the method or whatever you're working with, and it'll also help you with the IntelliSense there. So for me, this was important because I truly always hated doing this. I understand that depending on the implementation, it's required, but this really helped out with just turning it around quickly and making sure that other developers can use some of your code and understand it better. Again, /doc, it'll save your life. Don't forget it. And then there is also seeing, so if you're, for example, if you're building a front end and you're working in React and you have these specific errors within your browser, you can use Copilot to help you troubleshoot that specifically. So we'll start seeing that here in a second. Copilot explain this. Again, just another way that you can leverage Copilot, outside of the typical chat completions to help you in your workflow. And that's why I said that, a few minutes ago, yes, you could use it just for completions. Are you going to be using it really the quote unquote right way? Okay, maybe, but are you going to be using it the way that you want it to be most effective? I actually disagree with that. I think that it's these kinds of things, and making use of these preview and experimental features that makes it as good as you might want. How are we doing on time? 37. Okay, so let's move on to measuring impact with metrics viewer and GitHub API. Now, if you are a development team leader, one of the things that things that you want to know is, first of all, are my developers using this, and is it doing what I wanted to do, which is saving time. Now, one of the tools that we have available to answer those questions is the GitHub API. So towards the end of 2024, what GitHub did is release an API specifically to get metrics data out of your organization's usage of GitHub Copilot. And people went nuts and started building a bunch of dashboards in Kibana or and others, and to start to visualize that. And I wanted to show you a very quick way to actually start to explore that for yourself within your organization. It actually took me longer to set up the API token than it did to get this project started. So there's an open source Copilot metrics viewer application that you can just go ahead and fork it for yourself and start using it. Very active. They're pushing out pretty regularly into it. But I wanted to show the team here how that will manifest itself. So I went ahead and pulled that down. There's an env file and there's documentation, plenty of documentation to help you run through that. But we're going to go ahead and start up the app, and then we'll talk about some of the metrics that the API can afford you, and applications such as this can surface for you, such that you can make this a tool that you can understand better how your teams are faring in their day-to-day life with GitHub Copilot. This is not concurrencies data. This is all sample data that comes out of the box with the metrics viewer. What you will need to do to make make this work is just create a GitHub application. You need to be I'm an organization administrator for concurrency, so I can still I was able to do that without too much hassle. But you basically need a client ID and a secret, and then you just put those secrets in, and you're off to the races. And the documentation for this application does a pretty good job on making that clear on how to do that. Now, the most important part here is the data, right? Is what can you surface? And this is only an example, but you can start to see within your organization, how useful is it? How many developers are accepting their prompts? How many suggestions is Copilot making? And start to monitor that at an organizational level, you can also set this up to a team. So if you're using an enterprise or an organization at GitHub and licensing it that way, you can specify this content to be team specific or entire org specific. You can start to monitor what language is most prevalent, what language is using, or what developers are using what language, and how many suggestions are made, um, what editors they're using, albeit, there's really not, I mean, between JetBrains and VS Code, I personally wouldn't use anything else. And then Copilot chat, which is where you start to see some of the data about Copilot, GitHub Copilot, and the chat feature that we were just going through. And then quite possibly, especially for me, when you're nosy, the more interesting one is seed analysis. So you can start to see what users are actually using this. Who are they active? Are they inactive? Are you wasting money because people aren't using it? And it's hugely helpful to start to visualize some of your usage of Copilot within your organization or within your team. And by the way, if any of these metrics out of the box aren't enough for you, you can actually, and you want to dive in more, you can actually, just look at the API response and start to aggregate some of these numbers on your own and calculate some of this data to your specific use case. So I really like this. I went ahead and I forked it, and I plugged in concurrencies data, and I was really interested to see that. I shared it with a few people, and it was really useful to start to understand, hey, are people using this the way that we would like, or are they not using it at all? And hey, by the way, there's a lot of data that you can start to leverage. So huge impact here, and trying to understand ROI. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on just a tad, here, give me 1 second. All right, is outside of just, and there's other, by the way, there's other dashboards. This isn't just the one, and here's a screenshot of one of those that helps you visualize that data a little bit more. But there's a very interesting ROI calculation that one can make, and it's very simple to do. And we can keep the numbers pretty simple, where assume that we have an organization with 100 developers, and you talk to your developers, and you found that in general they save about half an hour of time using Copilot Studio, which I'm sorry, Copilot. And I'll be completely honest with you. I've had it, some days it saved me 30 minutes, some days it saved me 15 minutes, some days it saved me 2 hours, some days it actually saved me a full day, depending on what I'm doing that day. But it's pretty conservative to say it saves you half an hour a day. But if we take that number and multiply it by 100, that's about 50 hours, developers, that's about 50 hours daily that we're saving with half an hour for 100 developers. And let's assume that on average, our developers are at a salary of $100,000. And if we take that 50 hours and multiply it by $48, which is the roughly hourly rate for a $100,000 developer, we end up saving $2,400 a day by using Copilot. Now, if you multiply that by 260 days, which is 260 working days in a year, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, you're looking at about a $624,000 annual productivity gain just by using Copilot. Now, there's obviously costs associated with the seats and such, but I can guarantee you that the cost associated with paying for the seats for 100 developers is not nearly close to $624,000. And you will very quickly start to see ROI, and you can very quickly start to actually monitor it using these tools, which is hugely important. Now, other than that, I really wanted to spend some time talking about how we can leverage GitHub Copilot within your teams, and how to systemically do it. because that's the most important thing. And I think that Copilot we're making it more and more easy to make that a reality, especially with some of the preview and experimental features that I just talked to you about earlier today. But I challenge you to think through how we would incorporate that. And when I look at this, my number one thing is making use of the prompt feature and throwing that into your code base and the instructions. And using that, it would make it infinitely easier to ensure that developers are doing things by standard. It would shorten code reviews. And really, I found Copilot to be a very good rubber ducky. That's that's how I look at it. That's how I think about it. There's been times where, hey, I needed to go knock on somebody's door, and you've talked to Nick or you've talked to Brian today or seen them speak, and I have to run something by them. And by using Copilot, I don't need to bother them as much, but I do get to talk to them about other things, because it's hugely important to still collaborate. Now, are there any questions? I know I've been kind of on a soliloquy here, but are there any questions that anybody has? Adrian had one question with regard to, instead of creating a file with a spec, can Copilot enforce coding conventions on an existing file or even the whole solution? Absolutely. So it can absolutely do that, especially given your prompts. Now, it won't do it right away, where it'll look, unless you ask it to, where it'll look through all your code and tell you what you did wrong or what's out of the norm or out of the standard. But let's say that you give it one of the instructions in the instructions file are to enforce certain guidelines in your prompt. It will stay within the bounds of those instructions and ensure that it can correctly prompt you with the right information. And it'll do so while being mindful of the instructions that you provided. Now, it's really cool to see it work both in tandem with instructions and prompts, where that's when you start to really unlock some of those capabilities, where you're both using instructions, and then if you start to use prompts on top of that, those two will work in tandem to really supplement that experience and speed things up. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and go to a quick call to action, right? So how can we help? We have a few sessions and a few things that Concurrency would like to have the privilege to help you with, talking about Copilot Studio or Copilot or GitHub Copilot. We're happy to actually come out and help you set up one of these metrics viewers and just connect. So if there's another survey that you can do, just follow us, engage. I will hunt everybody down for LinkedIn, right? So I put my LinkedIn up for everyone. But I'll definitely make a point to connect. So don't be a stranger. I'm always happy to chat.
Not in there.
Thanks, Mac. We're gonna go ahead. We'll see you at the next session. Take care.
Thanks all.
So I'm gonna send this over to you.